welcome to everyone. It's my pleasure to preside over an extraordinarily gifted panel and to follow in the footsteps of a really rousing and appropriate and wonderful opening yesterday evening. The joke depicts two people in the desert, and they're on all fours, and they're obviously close to the end. Their lips are swollen, their tongues are swollen, and the sun is burning up over the horizon into a cloudless sky, and one turns to the other and says, "Oh, look, it's going to be another nice day." I feel like this whenever I enjoy the warm weather. I think one of our main purposes here is to find the basis and to strengthen the basis for optimism in a situation that gives many reasons for pessimism. But we must do this on a basis which is plausible. Just as we urge others to take climate science seriously, we must also confront the fact that we have to take political economy seriously. And the obstacles standing in the way of developing that new mentality are formidable, and they need to be confronted openly and directly. And here I would just say that we need to understand that the power relationships that exist today are pushing us in a direction which is at the root of the problems we're trying to address. The enormous increase in indebtedness since the last financial crisis has created a situation where those debts themselves demand increased production at every level. And if that production doesn't happen and those financial assets don't get the returns that they demand, then we will face a crisis. And we need political responses that confront those realities. And so when I talk about the last American election, I say, even though this is going to strike some people as really outrageous, I say that the biggest tragedy in the last election was not Trump's election, though that was tragic enough. The real tragedy was the way that the Sanders campaign, which had generated an enormous and almost incredible degree of enthusiasm of young people wanting a more fundamental change of the kind that is urgently required, that campaign was sidelined because business as usual is not going to solve this problem. And I think in Canada we are discovering that also, that the enthusiasm for our new government. Again, I was euphoric when Harper's government came to an end, but now we realize that the new government is not in the business of addressing the deep fundamental changes that would be needed if this trajectory is to be altered. Food for thought. I realize these are big issues. I want now to introduce a really extraordinary panel. We've changed the order a little bit. The first speaker will be Gordon McBean. And by the way, I need to point out that the Gordon who's here is not an imposter. The photo in the brochure is wrong. This is the real Gordon McBean who's going to speak to us. He's extraordinarily distinguished, a Nobel co-laureate, and I think very appropriate for our purposes, the chair of the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Prevention. I think we need a lot of that. So, Gordon, without further ado, I'll hand over to you.
Anyway, let me just say that the first slides are going to point out to you that the climate is warming if you didn't believe it. The data is that 2016 is the warmest year on record. 2017 was the second, and 2015 was the third warmest year on record. That's on record of actual direct observation, so back to the 1800s or before. And we've passed 1 degree Celsius global warming with the 2015 numbers. 2014 was 0.9 something or other. We can also say that in Canada, the warming rate is, well, globally it's warming at about just a little bit less than 0.2 degrees C per decade, which means in a century that's 2 degrees C in the present warming rate. But we are in Canada warming at least 50% faster than that. So we're warming faster in Canada, particularly in the north, but even in the south. So there's the warming, the hottest years, the global values. You see Canada being red has got more change than others. Canada itself. What I did want to emphasize that, as you've seen here recently with a tornado, we are actually globally having a vast increase in the number of extreme catastrophic events. These are data from Munich Re, which is showing the geophysical events, which is the red line along the bottom, are horrific when they happen, but fortunately they don't happen very often and they're not getting any in numbers. But the number of storms, floods, on heat waves are all increasing, and they account for about 80+% of the disasters around the world are floods, storms, and droughts, those kind of things, heat waves, wildfires, whereas the earthquakes and volcanoes, when they happen, are terrible, but they don't happen, fortunately, very often. You can see that the increased number, the blue line going up. Interesting, in 2017 was a really horrific year. The insured losses were over $130 billion US. The estimated societal costs are over $300 billion, but I don't like to use those numbers because that means you're putting a dollar value on life, and we shouldn't do that. But interestingly, the costs economically were mostly in 90% in North America, whereas the deaths, 10,000 people died. Over 60% of those were in Asia, in developing countries where floods and storms hit people. In Canada, we're also having an increase. There's the numbers, and there's the tornado that hit here on Friday, part of it. So moving right along, I think I want to emphasize that we shouldn't just think of climate change as an issue by itself. We need to think about the issues of disaster risk reduction, sustainable development, and all these other issues, bring them together as for policymakers and communities to work together. So what I call the Global Agenda 2030. And that's the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the Sendai Framework for Action on Disaster Risk Reduction. Just as a minor question is, how many besides me have ever heard of the Sendai Framework on Disaster Risk Reduction? Good. You're 100% better than most audiences I speak to. Everyone hears of the Paris Agreement, but since most of I think the more likelihood, unfortunately, reality is that we're going to address more of these things through disaster risk reduction strategies than we are going to be through climate change adaptation, as we'll come back to. Anyway, we need a comprehensive approach is needed. Just knowing quickly on the Paris Agreement, you know the first part is what we call mitigation, reducing the greenhouse gas emissions so that we try and achieve a target of less than 2 degrees Celsius warming. And that's 2 degrees with respect to the 1800s. We've already used up 1.1 of those, so we don't have far to go. 1.5, most scientists will say, there is no chance of achieving 1.5, unfortunately. The other part of the Paris Agreement is the adaptation side, and that's what I spend my time on. And we're supposed to have national adaptation plans. Well, as yet, we don't have one. So what are the projections for the future? Just looking quickly, you can see these are the projections. The blue line there, which shows, well, slightly less than 2 degrees C warming, is a very optimistic and unfortunately not likely to happen one. We could be warming as much as 4 or 6 degrees warming if we don't stop the emissions. And the important thing to recognize is, though there is some natural science uncertainty shown by that little blue bar at the end there, the big uncertainty as to where we're going is what society does. You can see the difference between all those choices, societal choices, as I call them, the Paris Agreement down at the bottom, the no policy at all at the top, and huge changes in between. So how do we get some response to people? Well, when I talk to business community, they always talk about the World Economic Forum is so important to them. Okay, so what does the World Economic Forum do? Well, they actually put out a global risk assessment every year. This is the 2018 Global Risk Assessment, which is they define as an uncertain event or condition that, if it occurs, will cause significant negative impact in several countries and industries within 10 years. They're not talking about decades, just 1 decade. And so what do? They assess them in terms of the risks as being high impact or high likelihood. So what are the ones in the upper corner up over there? Well, extreme weather events is seen to be the biggest risk in terms of impact and likelihood. The only one that's higher impact is nuclear war, but they hope they consider it as unlikely at this point. I hope they're right. So if we look at all the ones to do with the environment, you can see they're all high impact, high likelihood events, largely speaking: extreme weather, natural disasters, failure of governments to take action on climate change mitigation and adaptation. For some reason or other, they call these ones in here societal ones, but water crises, food crises, etc. The geopolitical ones, failure to take action, etc. And I guess the thing I want to point out is these are all connected. Climate change will affect the water, it affects the food, it will affect critical infrastructures. We have more tornadoes and those kind of things. So moving right along, they put out as part of this report this year, 2018, a little special preamble, and they said, we want to look at it. And they said, what are the 5 risks most likely to happen? As you can see, 3 of the 5 are basically what we're talking about today: climate change, extreme weather. Of the risks that are most likely to have the biggest impact, well, except for the nuclear war part, they're all environmental risks. And they make the statement, 2017, the CO2 emissions increased for the first time in recent years. They'd actually been going down, but now they're going up again. And their assessment, if you can read that text at the bottom, is that the assessment of the World Economic Forum's global risk assessment is that the countries are very unlikely to achieve the Paris Agreement, which I think we all agree anyway. So what is the Sendai Framework for Action? It's an agreement in Sendai, Japan, and it was built upon the development agenda, climate change, disaster risk reduction, and it basically says we need to work on 4 priority areas to understand disaster risk, to improve our disaster risk governance. In Canada, it's a mess, disaster risk government. I'll just go quickly through this. There are 17 goals and 169 targets. And the point is, really, this is where politics goes astray. I have been, up until July 4th, the president of the International Council for Science. We have the role internationally under the UN agreement that they set up what are called special groups for various negotiations. And if it's to do with science and technology, we're usually the lead of the science and technology major group at UN negotiations. So I had a great time at Sendai, got to sit up at the front, give talks, et cetera, et cetera. For the SDGs, it was pure difficulty, because they basically, all the people there were international diplomats who were arguing over the word, should we use the or they or this or that. And they would spend 5 hours on every word like that. That's how you ended up with 169 targets, because everyone had to have their own. Nonetheless, we think we have to work with it. It exists, countries have agreed to it, so let's not fuss about it, let's do it. And what we did with the International Council for Science was we put out a report just stressing that these interactions, these SDGs all work together. If you focus on one and say, I'm going to solve number 3, you could, by the way you do it, screw up number 7 or 9. I'm just picking numbers arbitrarily. So you have to really think together. So SDG 16 is on good governance, SDG 17 is on implementation, and that's where we're working with the international science community to find ways of doing the science for implementation. So, okay, quickly, in Canada, what are the 10 most costly disasters? Well, until the tornado here the other day, which is fortunately won't make the list. But the biggest one, and these are again in dollars because it's easier to count them that way, but the Fort McMurray fires had an estimated insurance cost of $4.9 billion. And the societal costs are probably close to $10 billion. What I like to emphasize, fortunately anyway, is the societal impacts. And this is a quote from Premier Notley, that today is not the end of the story. It's not the return to normal life. It's not a celebration. There will be this was She said this years ago, but anyway, it'll take work of years, not weeks, to recover. And the unfortunate reality is that if you look at the reds on those things, is that through that area, because of the changing climate, there is a 50% increase in the likelihood of more wildfires in those areas by 2050. Second biggest, the southern Alberta flood, the Calgary flood. Huge costs again, and again, the societal impact. This was a quote out of the media of a woman, a young lady who woke up, discovered her house was, the bedroom she'd grown up in was full of water from a flood, partially because her home was right on the edge of the river, which they liked for scenery, but it's not a very good place to live in that way. And by 2050, we'll have twice as many heavy precipitation events as we have now, and that means higher risks of floods. Eastern Canada ice storm affected here in Ottawa, but particularly Montreal. Huge costs, closed down Montreal for a month, 2 months, depending on what you were doing. And the real tragic part of it is that the Neurology Research Institute at McGill University studied children in their mother's womb during the time of the storm, when mothers were under total trauma. And what did they discover? Those children whose mothers experienced high stress scored lower on IQ and language performance tests than those mothers had less stress. So we're again seeing that societal health impact of these kind of events. And although with a warming climate, we won't have freezing rain in, say, October and maybe March, the one in January will actually have an increase by 40% in the number of heavy freezing rain events in January. So the risks are going up. I just say the other ones, the Toronto flood, the fire in Slave Lake, the Toronto flood. This is an interesting picture. The one, you probably can't see it, but that's actually Finch Avenue Road in eastern Toronto area that was wiped out because the water came down so heavily, the culvert overflowed and wiped out the road. But what we see in our infrastructure is running across that road that fortunately they didn't break, but were gas mains, electric power lines, TV cable lines, water lines, all were running through there, and they could have been blowing up a huge fire. They didn't, fortunately, but it shows our infrastructure needs to be rethinking in terms of the risk on these things. So, moving right along, heat waves. We've had huge heat waves in Europe. We're now seeing them in North America. In the United States, the data show that the deadliest weather-related event is, in terms of deaths, is heat. And if we say Toronto as an example, Meta's here, so I will use Toronto as an example, is that whereas we used to have about 12 hot days above 30 degrees C per year, by the middle of the century we'll be up to 48, and by the end of the century close to 60 hot days per summer. That's 2 months of hot days. And so the impacts are going to be on those kind of, unfortunately, the elderly people, the young people, the homeless people, etc. And the National Roundtable did a study on this and showed, I guess, the costs as well. So tornadoes, since you've seen them, this is not the one from here. I didn't get any pictures of the one from here, but there's Pine Lake. The Pine Lake tornado in the lower right left corner there, that's in Alberta, happened in 2000 in the summer. It was a trailer park. The tornado came in and blew it apart. There were 12 people killed, including a young child who was being cared by her mother, who was running desperately to find a place to hide, to get to a safe spot. And the wind swept away the child and killed it. So that woman will never get over that. And anyway, and when I went there to visit the site a year later, they'd managed to get a whole bunch of new people to move their trailers back in, but they had not done one single thing to put in anything for safety. There was no safe space, there was no warning system, there was no even cables to tie down the trailer so they don't blow apart when a tornado goes through. Anyway, there's the map of tornadoes in Canada. If I'm allowed to look up here. There's one tornado alley, and here's the other one, Windsor to Ottawa. And as we can see, that if we think of just with a climate situation warming, with more warming, in a sense, literally this band moves up. We're going to have more hot days, more heavy precipitation, and we're going to have more tornado risk in Canada. It's not something you can put a hard number on because they're so hard to identify. and to work out the science on it. But nonetheless, just thinking physics-wise, I'm a PhD in physics, although I'm a professor of political science now. So that's what happens to you when you're a government bureaucrat for 6 years. Anyway, another thing we need to worry about, and this is from the IPCC, just very quickly, recognizing the time, is that although the number of hurricanes in the Atlantic region are expected to go down, the number of Category 4 and 5 hurricanes will go up by as much as 50%, is the highest estimate. So what we're going to see is the increase of severe hurricanes on the east coast of North America. So disaster risk comes from three things, the hurricane or the tornado or the drought or whatever, but importantly it comes from exposure and vulnerability. And just say those are the key determinants of disaster risk. And although we're going to have that, we need to find ways of reducing exposure and vulnerability. Here's where governments need to work at all levels. We need to have it so that we build better homes. We don't build a home that when a tornado hits it blows apart. We can build them better. My institute engineering guys work on this. We need to have people not being allowed to build in the floodplains, or we can't have the mayor saying, no, we can't tell you that's a floodplain because that reduces the property value and hence our taxes go down. Oh, that's not allowed. Anyway, so we need to really adapt. It was interesting just yesterday on the CBC, was posted, on Thursday, an article, Destructive Weather Prompting Corporate Rethink on Ignoring Costs of Climate Change. We need to think about how to build resilience. This economist story in the CBC. So we have some people we can support. I don't know who this person was, but I quoted him anyway. We need a national climate change action strategy. We need to worry about how we, identifying, as I've been doing, the climate change and its impacts, stress the exposure and vulnerability and risk. We need to come up with action, with options, but importantly, we need to start doing some action. Yep. And just to say that it does make a difference. Here's an IPCC report. If you actually do, with current risk adaptation strategies, here's your number of people who are going to die. But if you actually put in some good strategies, you can reduce it by half in terms of heat. So there's evidence we can really make a difference if we take strategies in place. Just to show we have such things, this little valve here is called a backwater valve. It costs $100 to put it into your house when you're building it. It costs a few thousand to put it in after it's built. And what it does is prevent all that water that comes into the sewer system from the streets and runs up and fills your bed in that nice, beautiful recreation room you've spent thousands of dollars on with all those nice pictures, TVs, etc., furniture in it, is now full up with toilet water. At least it came up through your toilet. With that valve, you can stop that. And we're trying to get building codes in cities to say any new home is going to have that in it. And you can go on our website of ICLR. There's little brochures and all of this stuff. So we are taking action. We got Doppler weather radars now in Environment Canada and all that kind of stuff. So I just want to close almost by saying that, totally changing the subject, international science. How many people have ever heard of ICSU? Okay. So you can forget about it now because it doesn't exist anymore. The International Council for Science, usually known by its old acronym ICSU, on July 4th, 2018, and there's a couple of months ago, formally merged with the International Social Science Council to create one new International Science Council. And if your eyesight is really good, much better than mine, that's me sitting up there chairing the meeting in Paris. And so despite what it says on your program, I am not the president of the International Council for Science. First of all, it doesn't exist anymore. And secondly, my term ended on July 4th. Anyway, what we're trying to do is bring together all these groups. So we've got math, physics, chemistry, all that kind of stuff, but also now public opinion, economics, political science, peace. These international organizations are now all part of one international organization called the International Science Council to advance science as a global public good, mobilize science, worry about the free and responsible practice of science. You know why we lose international votes? Canada, we bid to host things, we bid to do this, we bid to that, and somebody stands up and says, what about the visa problem? I couldn't get into Canada for the last conference you held. Or there was one conference I went to, 70 to 80 scientists of credible type never got their visas. to attend the meeting. And just, if I got one more minute, I'll just say that the one person who is most outspoken about this, who doesn't get into Canada, well, only with great difficulty now, but for a while couldn't get in at all, because he spent time in jail. Well, what was he? He was a psychologist who was Nelson Mandela's assistant, and he spent 10 years in jail helping Nelson Mandela survive through these things. And Canada says, no, you've been in jail, we don't let you in. He finally got in recently. Anyway, he's a good friend of mine. Anyway, the international programs also are sponsoring a whole bunch of science programs. I'll just show them. Future Earth on research for sustainability, disaster risk reduction, climate change. And I want to see if we can't bring all this together with the Canadian programs to actually create a global science team working together. And so that we need is this comprehensive approach of bringing the science, the observing systems, the policy people in together, nationally and internationally. And most importantly, we want to build on science for the benefit of our children and grandchildren. That's the statue of Einstein outside the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, which symbolically my children are sitting, well, my daughter, her husband, and 3 grandkids. Or you can hold up the earth as scientists, but we got to do it for intergenerational, international equity. And this slide, I don't know who ever sent it to me, but somebody did. I use it all the time. We are standing to stand here talking, as I'm doing to you now, as the tsunami is coming towards us. We need action. So thank you.